Canada throughout the years has blossomed from small settlements across the East Coast to a thriving nation spanning ocean to ocean. Today we look at Canada from the first settlers to sovereignty to modern day and its defining moments ranked in importance to Canadian identity and legacy. We use historical significance, looking at specific people, events, and locations that are important and have left us legacy on what is Canada today. Centuries before any Europeans set foot in Canada, lived hundreds of tribes of thriving Native American people, their identity forever part of Canadian culture thousands of years later. Despite the hardships they would later face, these tribes created a thriving and unique culture embracing a respectful relationship with the land. Fast forward to the early 1600s, hundreds of years after Columbus has discovered the Americas for the Europeans, the first European settlers would come to Canada. Settlements would soon pop up around Canada's east coast and what is now Quebec and Ontario, setting up what would become New France in British North America. In the following 200 years, the British and French would set up distinct and thriving societies in what is now Canada, but tensions between the two in Europe would lead up to the 7 Years' War. The war in Europe would also spread to the British colonies and the French colonies in North America, leading to them going to war. As the British population in North America outnumbered the French 10-1, the British won in North America, meaning France would secede New France to Britain in 1763, becoming a British territory. These events set up what was the foundation of Canada and is ranked 13th most significant event in Canadian history. Following the expanded territories, the tensions between Canadian territories and U.S. states would grow, leading to the War of 1812, which resulted in both sides attacking one another, which saw the British burning down the White House. But after the war, not much changed, except seeing formal borders drawn between the two nations. Following the war, Canadian independence movements began to grow, especially with the Canadian middle class, even resulting in many rebellions, including the 1937 to 1938 rebellions seeking more political reform. The British government feared that with the growing independence sentiment that they would lose Canada if it were to join the United States in independence. This fear led to the British to establish Canada as a self-governing democracy following the British North America Act or the Confederation of Canada on July 1st, 1867. During the first few decades of Canadian Confederation, the government would establish a strong natural resource industry in lumber and pelts, as well as connecting Canada with the Trans-Canada Railway. As this era saw Canadian borders being established and independence created, this ranks as the most important events in Canadian history. Following into the 1890s, we saw Canada enter the era of Great Transformation, transforming from an era of dirt poor farmers to an unprecedented age of prosperity for Canadians. As a result of economic growth in Canada, many Europeans immigrated to Canada seeking a better future, reaching all-time immigration highs with almost 100,000 immigrants per year at the turn of the century. With vast lands, many would become successful farmers despite the difficulty of the Canadian winter. But following the turn of the century, many Canadians would reap the changes and benefits of the Industrial Revolution. Many farmers going into cities to work at jobs in factories, the bad working conditions for many Canadian workers, such as dangerous working conditions and little pay, led to the first unions of Canada being formed despite great resistance. During the era at the turn of the century, we saw Canada industrialize and see Canadian cities grow into thriving industrial hubs. As Canada shifted into the industrial age, we saw the first metropolitan and urban areas created, which last to this day. The era of the Great Transformation ranks 14th in the most significant historical events in Canadian history. But as soon after, geopolitical tensions in Europe would throw Canada into the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen at that point. as Canada's ties with the British meant it was an extension of the British Empire. It automatically joined the First World War following the British. Canada was a young nation which never fought in foreign conflict before. This war would show the world that Canada was a strong and vivacious nation that could hold its own in a conflict, with more than 1 million Canadian men going to fight in the war, with 66,000 deaths and 175,000 casualties. This is the most costly war in Canadian history to this day. At the infamous Battle of the Somme, Passchendaele, and Vimy Ridge, we saw huge Canadian casualty, but also a never-dying Canadian spirit as they fought on the front lines, winning against the German front. Especially at Vimy Ridge, we saw the young Canadian army defeat the Germans to take Vimy Ridge, where the French and British had failed. This battle was a defining moment in Canadian history as it showed the world Canada could hold its own without Britain, ranking this as the 10th most important event in Canadian history. After the war, Canada would gain international respect as a nation rather than a British dominion. Furthermore, gaining control over its foreign affairs from the British. This landmark change granted Canada control over its foreign affairs and is vastly important to the legacy of Canada, ranking 9th in most significant events in Canadian history. Following the war came the Roaring Twenties. Compared to the United States, Canada's 20s didn't roar as much. Compared to the US economy, Canada's didn't experience much economic growth post-war, rather a sluggish economy. Although Canada pushed many social changes, after many years of protests, women finally gained the vote in 1918, but negative social changes also occurred. During this era, the residential schools reached its peak, with 150,000 children taken from their families and put into these schools, which removed their Indigenous identity. As this era saw social changes, it ranks the 15th most significant events in Canadian history. But following the not-so-roaring 20s, Canada entered the worst economic period of its short history. During the 1930s, because of the stock market crash and people investing in debt, caused the Great Depression. The economy of Canada was hit hard by the Great Depression. With a fragile and interconnected economy at the peak of the Depression in 1933, 30% of the workforce was out of work. Without any social programs or a social safety net, many of these Canadians faced very difficult times. The prairie provinces hit especially hard with a diminishing agricultural industry, resulting in many of the provinces going bankrupt. Many citizens depending on the very little government assistance. The economic hardship also resulted in the lowest immigration in the country's history, furthermore denying immigration from Jewish people fleeing the Nazis, especially well known on the St. Louis. As a result, many Jews died, and the immigration policies during this era ranked 12th in most significant events in Canada's history. Furthermore, the Depression's economic toll on Canada and its citizens ranked 11th because of the long-lasting impacts it had on future generations of Canadians and legislation. But as by the end of the decade, Canada had emerged from the economic depression, possibly by jobs war production needed, as Canada was once again thrown into another conflict in the Second World War. During the war, 1.1 million Canadians served in the armed forces, as well as millions more working on the war effort on the home front. During the war, Canadian soldiers fought valiantly on the front lines, as well as providing crucial support to the British amidst the naval blockade of Europe by German U-boats. During the recapture of Europe at the turning point of the war, Canada played immensely important parts in military campaigns against the Nazis. Canada joined the Allies as they stormed Normandy Beach in the largest military landing in history. Canada was also tasked with liberating the Netherlands from the Germans. With brilliant military strategy, Canada liberated the nation in May of 1945, helping the Allies turn the tide of the war and win by the summer of 1945. As a result of Canadian involvement in the war, Canada helped turn the tides and change the course of history, ranking as the second most important event in Canadian history. Following the end of the war, Canadians benefited from a thriving economy back home. But just as a war had ended, a new one had begun. The Cold War between the West and the Communists began, causing Canadians to feel a mix between comfort and fear. As Canada's economy grew, it welcomed an unprecedentedly large amounts of immigrants, totaling millions. With Canada's growing economy and population, the government saw it financially possible to roll out more social programs at the request of the people. Many social programs came to Canada during the post-war era, including Medicare, family allowance, and old age security, which still have a legacy to this day. But amidst the economic and population growth, Canada was put between the superpowers of the Cold War, the Soviets and the United States, both literally and figuratively. Amidst the Cold War, Canada joined NATO and NORAD to form tighter military connections with other Western nations. The economic growth, along with the growing middle class, this era ranks 8th in most significant events and eras in Canadian history. Furthermore, the military alliances that Canada formed and are still closely tied to today leave a lasting legacy and is ranked 7th most important in Canadian history. But soon, Canada would face tension not only internationally, but internally. French and English relations would soon turn sour, as the difference between culture and identity, as well as the federal government's interference on the Quebec government's control over the people, led many Quebecers to call for independence from Canada. This led many within the government and population to call for Quebec's independence in Canada. One group among those calling for independence is the FLQ. This group kidnapping and killing Provincial Labour Minister Pierre Laporte and British diplomat James Cross, and he fight for Quebec's independence through violent means, leading to the notorious October Crisis, which was the highest tension the nation has ever had in modern history between Quebec and the federal government. The tension between the federal government and Quebec leading up to the October Crisis is a profound moment in Canadian history and ranks 3rd in most significant events in Canadian history. But soon, these issues between the French and Canadian resolve in the coming decades, as Canada's identity would shift from one of divide between the British and French to one that embraced its multiculturalism and welcomed people from around the world as Canadians. Following the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, Canada would start to form its modern identity. It welcomed millions of immigrants from around the world, from countries outside of Europe, such as China, India, and many more, this changing Canada's identity to one that is proud of its multiculturalism. In Toronto, Canada's largest city today, the immigrant population makes up half of the 3 million citizens. Its peaceful and democratic policies attract millions to call Canada home. Its changing demographic and multicultural identity ranks 5th and most significant to Canadian history. In addition, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, the rise of the personal computer started. Soon, this industry would become a multi-billion-dollar industry, with Canada leading the way of smartphones with BlackBerry for many years. The advancement of technology in the 90s has had a great impact on our lives today, ranking 6th in the most significant events in Canadian history. Finally, as a result of the September 11th attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda in 2001, we saw 3,000 innocent lives lost, and Canada joining the United States to invade Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime that harbored Al-Qaeda. This event, setting up Canada's longest war, as well as new precedent, these events ranked 4th and most significant to Canadian history. To end, the changes to Canada are profound. From a barren farmland colony of the British to an urban, modern, thriving, democratic, and multicultural nation which 38 million people call home today.